Hello Year 8. I've been reading carefully your ideas about the story The Landlady, and I'm really pleased with how you are picking up the hints and suggestions that something isn't quite right with the situation that Billy Weaver has found himself in. So let's recap briefly. Billy's approach to the house, to the bed and breakfast, had a sense of foreboding. Remember, that was the key word. Now, that was created mostly by the setting. Then, when Billy entered the bed and breakfast, there were a few further hints of foreboding, that there was something vaguely unusual or unsettling about the woman in the way that she spoke and acted. Now, given what we know about the story that we've already read, The Lamb to the Slaughter, we can guess that Roald Dahl is building up to something quite dark and quite strange. And indeed he is, as we will ultimately discover. Now, we're not going to read the whole of the rest of the story today, but we are going to read most of it. But we're going to have a different reading focus. So listen very carefully. We are moving from the key word foreboding to the next key word, foreshadowing. Now, foreshadowing is a technique that is related to, and indeed fairly similar to, the idea of foreboding. But let me clarify. So, foreboding is how a writer creates a general sense that something isn't quite right. So, for example, the weather at the start of the story of The Landlady was described as like a blade of ice. The building's paintwork was crumbling. Billy felt compelled to ring the doorbell. All subtle hints that all is not well. But foreshadowing is a slightly different technique, in which a writer directly hints to the reader about something specific that could be significant later in the story. It could actually signal to the reader what may happen later in the story. It's usually a detail or an event that will become important at some point, and the reader will remember how it was referred to earlier in the story. Now, to explain this further, it's best for me to give you a couple of examples from the novel that we read at the start of the year, Animal Farm. Now, remember how immediately after the revolution, the milk disappeared. Now, we didn't think much of it at the time, but we later learned that the milk had been stolen by the pigs. Now, that milk being stolen, the milk going missing, was an early foreshadowing that the pigs were corrupt, that they were thieves, that they did not have the best interests of all of the animals at their heart. Another example, when the dogs attacked Boxer, when he spoke out at a general meeting, it foreshadowed that ultimately Boxer would be portrayed and that he would sent off to be slaughtered later in the novel, and indeed he was. So, bearing that in mind, listen closely to this next bit of the story as Billy and the landlady speak more, and Billy starts to question what is happening to him. Your task is to try and listen to the foreshadowings. What are the suggestions as to what may happen further on in the story? She took him into a small but charming front bedroom, switching on the light as she went in. "The morning sun comes right in the window, Mr. Perkins." "It is Perkins, isn't it?" "No, it's Weaver." "Mr. Weaver, how nice. I put a water bottle between the sheets to air them out, Mr. Weaver. It's such a comfort to have a hot water bottle in a strange bed with clean sheets, don't you agree? And you may light the gas fire if at any time you feel chilly." "Thank you," Billy said. "Thank you ever so much." He'd noticed that the bedspread had been taken off the bed and that the duvet had been neatly turned back on one side, all ready for someone to get in. "I'm so glad you appeared," she said, looking earnestly into his face. "I was beginning to get worried." "That's all right," Billy answered brightly. "You mustn't worry about me." He put his suitcase on the chair and started to open it. "And what about supper, my dear? Did you manage to get anything to eat before you came?" I'm not a bit hungry, thank you, he said. I think I'll just go to bed as soon as possible because tomorrow I've got to get up rather early and report to the office. Very well then. I'll leave you now so that you can unpack. But before you go to bed, would you be kind enough to pop into the sitting room on the ground floor and sign the book? Everyone has to do that because it's the law of the land. And we don't want to go breaking any laws at this stage of the proceedings, do we? She gave him a little wave of the hand and went out quickly, out of the room, and closed the door. Now, the fact that his landlady appeared to be slightly off her rocker didn't worry Billy in the slightest. After all, she was not only harmless, there was no question about that, but she was also quite obviously a kind and generous soul. He guessed that she had probably lost a son in the war or something like that, and she'd never got over it. So, a few minutes later, after unpacking his suitcase and washing his hands, he trotted downstairs to the ground floor and entered the living room. His landlady wasn't there, but the fire was glowing in the hearth, and the little dachshund hound was still sleeping in front of it. The room was wonderfully warm and cosy. I'm a lucky fellow, he thought, rubbing his hands. This is all right. He found the guest book lying open on the piano. So he took out his pen and wrote down his name and address. There were only 2 other entries above his on the page, and, as one always does with guest books, he started to read them. One was a Christopher Mulholland from Cardiff. The other, Gregory W. Temple from Bristol. That's funny, he thought suddenly. Christopher Mulholland. It rings a bell. Now, where on earth had he heard that rather unusual name before? Was he a boy at school? No. Was it one of his sister's numerous young men, perhaps? Or a friend of his father's? No, it wasn't either of those. He glanced down again at the book. Christopher Mulholland, 231 Cathedral Road, Cardiff. Gregory W. Temple, 27 Sycamore Drive, Bristol. As a matter of fact, now he came to think of it, he wasn't at all sure that the second name didn't have almost as much of a familiar ring about it as the first. Gregory Temple, he said aloud, searching his memory. Christopher Mulholland. Such charming boys, a voice behind him answered, and he turned and saw his landlady sailing into the room with a large tray in her hands. She was holding it well out in front of her and rather high up, as though the tray were a pair of reins on a frisky horse. They sound somehow familiar, he said. They do? How interesting. I'm almost positive I've heard those names somewhere before. Isn't that strange? Maybe it was in the newspapers. They weren't famous in any way, were they? I mean, famous cricketers or footballers or something like that. Famous, she said, setting the tea tray down on the low table in front of the sofa. Oh, no, I don't think they were famous, but they were both extraordinarily handsome. Both of them were, I can promise you that. They were tall and young and handsome, my dear, just exactly like you. Once more, Billy glanced down at the book. Look here, he said, noticing the dates. This last entry is over 2 years old. It is? Yes, indeed. And Christopher Mulholland's is nearly a year before that, more than 3 years ago. Dear me, she said, shaking her head and heaving a dainty little sigh. I would never have thought it. How time does fly away from us all, doesn't it, Mr. Wilkins? It's Weaver, Billy said. W-E-A-V-E-R. Oh, of course it is, she cried, sitting down on the sofa. How silly of me. I do apologise. In one ear and out the other, that's me, Mr. Weaver. You know something, Billy said. Something that's quite extraordinary about all this. No, dear, I don't. Well, you see, both of these names, Mulholland and Temple. I not only seem to remember each one of them separately, so to speak, but somehow or other, in some peculiar way, they were connected together as well, as though they were both famous for the same sort of thing, if you see what I mean, like Batman and Robin, or Churchill and Roosevelt. How amusing, she said. But come over here now, dear, and sit down beside me on the sofa, and I'll give you a nice cup of tea and a ginger biscuit before you go to bed. You really shouldn't bother, Billy said. I didn't mean you to do anything like that. He stood by the piano, watching her as she fussed about with the cups and saucers. He noticed that she had small, white, quickly moving hands and red fingernails. I'm almost positive it was in the newspapers. I saw them, Billy said. I'll think of it in a second. I'm sure I will. There is nothing more tantalising than a thing like this which lingers just outside the borders of one's memory, and he hated to give it up. Now, wait a minute, he said. Wait just a minute. Mulholland. Christopher Mulholland. Wasn't that the name of the Eton schoolboy who was on a walking tour through the West Country, and then all of a sudden, milk, she said. Sugar? Yes, please. And then all of a sudden, Eton schoolboy? She said. Oh no, my dear, that can't be right, because my Mr. Mulholland was certainly not an Eton schoolboy when he came to me. He was a Cambridge undergraduate. Now, come over here. Sit next to me and warm yourself in front of this lovely fire. Come on, your tea is all ready for you. She patted the empty place beside her on the sofa, and she sat there, smiling at Billy and waiting for him to come over. He crossed the room slowly and sat down on the edge of the sofa. She placed his teacup on the table in front of him. There we are, she said. How nice and cosy this is, isn't it? Billy started sipping his tea. She did the same. For half a minute or so, neither of them spoke, but Billy knew that she was looking at him. Her body was half turned towards him, and he could feel her eyes resting on his face, watching him over the rim of her teacup. Now and again, he caught a whiff of a peculiar smell that seemed to emanate directly from her person. It was not in the least unpleasant. Well, he wasn't quite sure what it reminded him of. Pickled walnuts, new leather, or was it the corridors of a hospital? Mr. Mulholland was a great one for his tea, she said at length. Never in my life have I seen anyone drink as much tea as dear, sweet Mr. Mulholland. I suppose he left fairly recently, Billy said. He was still puzzling his head about the two names. He was positive now that he had seen them in the newspapers, in the headlines. Left, she said, arching her brows. But my dear, he never left. He's still here. Mr. Temple is also here. They're on the 3rd floor, both of them together. And Year 8, we will leave the story on that surprising cliffhanger until next time, when we will discover what happens at the end. So, there are 2 parts to this task that I want you to complete. Now, I've shared with you a 2-part assignment. One is a copy of the text of the section of story that we've just read. Now, what I want you to do is to read this section of text back to yourself, and using a highlighter, highlight anything that you think could be a foreshadowing of something that could be significant to the story. Hints, suggestions as to what could happen later. Think about things that stand out to you. Look for unusual things that Billy notices, unusual things that the landlady says and what the landlady does. Now, the second task is straightforward, and it asks you to copy selections from the text that you have highlighted and to copy them into the table on the slides also shared with you. Now, I want you to write me a short comment explaining what you think your quotations may foreshadow about the situation that Billy has found himself in. I'm interested to know if any of you can really guess what's going on here. Now, there are further detailed instructions on the slides. So, a final thought. Remember, these stories are dark, so be led by that assumption.